Chapter 26. When time delivers its verdict. Every covenant ends the same way, not in noise, but in reckoning. Not in sudden catastrophe, but in the quiet moment when history asks its final question and waits for an answer. This book has argued that time is not neutral, that history does not wander aimlessly, that beneath economics, politics, generations, and power lies a deeper structure, covenantal time, ordered by number, memory, and responsibility. From Genesis 47 to July 4, 1776, from May 14, 1948, to the present hour, the same architecture has been activated, mirrored, and tested. Now the testing phase is no longer theoretical. The cycles described in these pages converge in periods when correction can no longer be delayed. When memory has faded, when debt has exceeded restraint, when power has detached from law, when identity has replaced ethics, when covenant is invoked rhetorically but violated in practice. At such moments, history does not negotiate, it renders judgment. Judgment, as used here, does not mean destruction. It means exposure. What was hidden is revealed. What was deferred is forced forward. What was tolerated becomes unsustainable. The structures that once carried civilization either prove real or collapse under their own weight. Israel and the United States now stand at such a moment, not as victims of fate, nor as chosen exceptions, but as bearers of a covenant under examination. Their trials are different in form, but identical in meaning. One faces relentless external pressure, the other faces accelerating internal fracture. Both are symptoms of the same condition, a widening gap between covenantal foundation and lived reality. History is not asking for perfection, it is asking for alignment. Alignment between law and power, between memory and action, between prosperity and responsibility, between identity and ethics. The warning, therefore, is not mystical. It is structural. When debt replaces discipline, correction follows. When force replaces law, instability follows. When memory is abandoned, repetition follows. When a covenant is hollowed out, judgment follows. Numbers do not cause these outcomes. They mark them. Cycles do not impose punishment. They announce it. The final danger is not collapse, but denial. Civilizations do not fall because they are warned. They fall because they refuse to listen. They mistake patience for permission, delay for immunity, power for permanence. But time does not grant immunity. The lesson repeated throughout history is this: what is not voluntarily corrected will be corrected by force. This is the last warning contained in these pages, not shouted, not dramatized, but stated plainly. The covenant can still be renewed, but it cannot be ignored. Renewal does not require unanimity, ideology, or nostalgia. It requires memory, restraint, humility, and the restoration of limits. It requires remembering that power was never the goal, order was. That prosperity was never the promise, responsibility was. If renewal occurs, the cycle does not end in collapse. It bends, it resets, it preserves what is essential and releases what is exhausted. If renewal does not occur, the cycle still ends, but without mercy. History has already moved from warning to decision. The clocks are no longer whispering. They are counting down, not to catastrophe, but to verdict. And a verdict, once delivered, cannot be appealed. This book does not ask the reader to believe. It asks the reader to observe the numbers, to observe the cycles, to observe the patterns that have never failed to repeat when ignored. Time has spoken before. It is speaking again now. The only question left unanswered is not what time will do, but what we will do before it finishes speaking. Because when time finally falls silent, history does not begin anew. It moves on. Chapter 27. The Historical Cycles Theory of Manuel Martínez and its influence on economic decision-making. A comparative analysis, United States, Europe, Mexico, Spain, and Israel. Introduction. The historical cycles theory developed by Manuel Martínez is based on a central proposition. History does not merely repeat events, it repeats decision structures. While contexts, technologies, and actors change, societies recurrently confront similar economic dilemmas when collective memory fades. These recurring moments force governments, institutions, and populations to make comparable choices under structurally analogous conditions. Martínez identifies 5 principal temporal cycles: 28, 56, 84, 112, and 140 years each, representing a deeper level of historical recurrence, from generational turnover to civilizational transformation. Economic policy, as the aggregate outcome of political, social, and cultural forces, is one of the clearest domains in which these cycles manifest. The 28-year cycle, generational adjustment. Definition. The 28-year cycle corresponds roughly to one economically active generation. It marks the transition between those who experienced a crisis firsthand and those who know it only through institutional memory. Recurring economic patterns. Alternation between credit expansion and monetary tightening. Partial reforms addressing prior excesses. Shifts in fiscal priorities and labor structures. Historical examples. United States. 1970s, stagflation, oil shocks, and restrictive monetary policy under Volcker. Roughly 28 years later, late 1990s, early 2000s expansion, culminating in the technology bubble. Spain. 1980s, industrial restructuring after the democratic transition. Roughly 28 years later, real estate expansion preceding the 2008 financial crisis. Mexico. 1982, debt crisis and structural adjustment. Roughly 28 years later, macroeconomic stability combined with renewed external debt exposure. 2. The 56-year cycle, institutional amnesia. Definition. After 2 generations, direct memory of systemic crisis disappears from decision-making elites. Risk tolerance increases, and regulatory discipline weakens. Recurring economic patterns. Financial deregulation. Rising leverage and asset inflation. Overconfidence in economic models and institutions. Historical examples. United States. The 1929 Great Depression led to strict financial regulation. Approximately 56 years later, deregulation and financial innovation culminated in the 2008 crisis. Europe. Post-World War II, fiscal discipline and monetary conservatism. Roughly 56 years later, deep financial integration, without full fiscal union, led to the Eurozone crisis. Spain. Loss of memory of prior banking crises contributed to the collapse of the savings banks, Cajas, in 2008. 3. The 84-year cycle, structural return definition. The 84-year cycle is the core axis of Martínez's theory. It marks the return of systemic tensions, nationalism, protectionism, social polarization, and challenges to the prevailing economic order. Recurring economic patterns. Trade barriers and tariffs. Expanding state intervention. Rapid debt accumulation. Preference for sovereignty over efficiency. Historical examples. United States. 1930s, protectionism, the New Deal, and expansion of federal authority. Roughly 84 years later, from 2017 onward, renewed tariffs, economic nationalism, and strategic industrial policy. Europe. 1930s, collapse of liberal economic consensus. Roughly 84 years later, fragmentation, populism, and pressure on European integration. Israel. 1948, state formation under conditions of economic scarcity and conflict. Approaching the 84-year mark, internal polarization and reassessment of the economic social contract. 4. The 112-year cycle, institutional reconstruction. Definition. At approximately 4 generations, societies face structural exhaustion of existing institutions. Incremental reforms are insufficient. Comprehensive redesign becomes unavoidable. Recurring economic patterns. Fundamental fiscal reform. Redefinition of welfare systems. New regulatory frameworks for dominant industries. Historical examples. United States. Transition from late 19th century monopolistic capitalism to mid-20th century regulatory state. Present, debates over technology monopolies, public debt, and state intervention. Spain. From the crisis of the restoration system to the democratic transition. Present, pressure on pensions, regional financing, the welfare state. Mexico. From post-revolutionary consolidation to modern state capitalism. Present, redefinition of the state's role in energy, infrastructure, and social policy. V. The 140-year cycle, civilizational and hegemonic shift. Definition. The 140-year cycle reflects changes in global economic leadership, dominant currencies, and geopolitical power structures. Recurring economic patterns. Crisis of confidence in the dominant monetary system. Reconfiguration of global trade routes and alliances. Emergence of new economic powers. Historical examples. Europe. From imperial dominance in the 19th century to loss of hegemony after the World Wars. Present. Strategic dependency and declining global influence. United States. Rise to economic hegemony in the 20th century. Present. Increasing strain on monetary dominance and global leadership. Israel. Integration into a high-technology and security-driven economic model as a response to long-term existential cycles. Conclusion. The historical cycles theory of Manuel Martínez does not argue that history repeats mechanically, but that economic decisions recur when structural conditions resemble past moments and collective memory has eroded. The layered cycles of 28, 56, 84, 112, and 140 years provide a framework for understanding why societies repeatedly confront similar economic dilemmas despite technological and institutional progress. Recognizing these cycles does not eliminate risk, but it improves foresight. In economic policy, as in history itself, time ultimately demands accountability.